for you up next on shale oil and gas. And without further ado, I will pass it over to one of our distinguished executive committee members, President of Dawson Strategic, Laura Dawson.
Distinguished. Thank you, David. It's good to be distinguished, especially among such a distinguished group. I think I have got a very, very cool panel, so I'm grateful for the Canada-U.S. Law Institute and David for giving me what I think is the coolest panel. But it's also a bit tricky in that it's like one of those buy one, get one free shoe offers. So what I've got is a buy one, get one free shale oil and gas technical infrastructure aspect, and then we have some learned policy wonks who are going to give us the bilateral and trilateral view on that. So we're going to go from the specific to the general. Basically, we're going to look at what's going on, and then what governments can do to help it along, and what governments can do to screw it up, and how we can minimize the amount of government screwing up that we do. Having the shale oil and gas panel, I think, is very cool because it is one of the most remarkable economic game changers that we've had in recent years. The technological advances that now allow us to extract shale oil and gas reserves are a game changer not only for North American energy, but for the North American economy and North American manufacturing competitiveness. It really changes our competitiveness in the world and perhaps will help keep China from eating our lunch. But we have to be able to do something with it. We have to be able to optimize the benefits and advantages that we have. And as you heard this morning from some of our earlier speakers, in a few short years, North America has gone from a natural gas importer to a potential natural gas exporter, emphasis on potential, and having the right infrastructure to move energy from where it's extracted to where it needs to be and where we can extract the most benefit. This requires policy. It requires good policy. And I may add, it requires swift and responsive policy. One of the things I think we're dealing with is sort of a disjunction in decision time horizons. We've got representatives who have worked in the private sector, who know that decision time horizons for business are very, very fast. And they're related to profit, markets, opportunities. We have folks from the government, and for government, decision horizons are very, very slow and tend to be related to electoral cycles and all sorts of other things, not necessarily related to the market. And then thirdly, we have the commodity itself, energy products, oil and gas, which move on a lithic cycle. And so that offers its own set of challenges in terms of the nature of the commodity that we're dealing with. So I'm really pleased to have the expertise that I do with me. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start again with our very specific oil and gas, shale oil and gas, regulatory infrastructure folks first. We may take a bit of a break and then for a couple of questions and then move into our policy panel. What can governments do to help it along or at least minimize the screwing up factor? So I am delighted to be able to introduce you to our panel. I'm not going to give you a long introduction, but just in brief terms, I have to my immediate right, Carol Battershall. Carol is the Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy in Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, and she's formerly held senior positions with BP. And I understand, for this audience, one of her most interesting facts is she is a graduate of Case Western University. Yay! To Carol's right, we have Stephen Reed. Stephen's a partner at Steptoe and Johnson Law Firm in Washington, D.C., and Stephen is the guy to know about pipelines. He's head of the firm's pipeline group. He works on federal regulation for pipelines. He is all pipelines all the time. And so we're delighted to have someone of his expertise with us. To his right, we have Mark Fisher. And I am delighted to tell you that Mark is the executive director of the Council of the Great Lakes Region. The reason I'm delighted is because I used to be the acting director, and then Mark came and has put us on a very, very good path. The Council of the Great Lakes Region is an organization of which the Canada-US Law Institute is a parent, and it represents the interests and some advocacy work for the 8 states and 2 provinces of the Great Lakes. Formerly, Mark had a tiny little job advising the Prime Minister of Canada on various economic policy and energy issues, bilateral issues, trilateral issues. He's got a terrific wealth of policy experience, and also worked with the Government of Ontario, private sector. And I apologize, I couldn't find a bio for Mark in the book, but there may be one that exists virtually on the Cousely site, so please avail yourself to that. Regrettably, we do not have Richard Cunningham with us this morning, so playing the role of Richard will be Stephen Reed. But we do have Sue Sarnio, and Sue is not only a great friend, but she's a former boss. Sue was my boss at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. She was formerly the Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs, handling all things economic and just 1 or 2 energy files from time to time. Sue is now, I guess whatever we infected her with in Ottawa stuck, because Sue is now back in Washington, but she's the Director of Canadian Affairs with the State Department in the Western Hemisphere Affairs Department. So we are really grateful to have Sue here. And Sue is going to be, Sue is the resident expert on all things regulatory cooperation beyond the border and how to make the weird Canada-US bilateral relationship trilateral. So we're going to be talking to Sue about some of the bigger initiatives that our governments are embarking on, hoping to embark on, etc. So that was my long-winded introduction. I hope you forgive the windiness of it. I'm going to turn it over first to Carol to speak for about 10 minutes. Each of our panelists will talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get into some Q&A. And what would a panel be without some good visual aids? So Carol's got some PowerPoint as well.
So we'll get to the slides eventually. I wanted to start with a little bit of facts and figures, and I'm happy to be here. I am indeed a Case Western grad, an Ohio native, grew up in Cleveland and started for a little company called Standard Oil of Ohio. But for the last about 5 years, I've been working for the federal government. And the shale revolution that we want to talk about is actually one of the key drivers for why the federal government and myself are working on a year-long strategy on energy infrastructure. And so I'd like to share a little bit this morning, just a few things to get started on the increases in shale oil and gas in both Canada and the US, and how that dramatic increase is impacting the North American energy infrastructure. But I confess I will spend a good part of the time on a little bit of the infrastructure study that I'm working on, because, you know, what studies the government is working on is just fascinating, and I know you're going to want to hear all about that. So the revolution in shale oil and gas, I think, has been somewhat under the radar. Maybe not everyone works on energy policy full-time and reads all the facts and figures, but recently, and this is a big deal, recently the U.S. surpassed Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil supplier. And that's just, it's a huge change, and you can look back at just 10 years, the last 10 years, to see what's happening, and it's been pretty remarkable. The U.S. oil imports peaked in about 2005, 2006, and at that point, as a percentage of consumption, the U.S. was importing 60% of its oil. And then gas shale production started to dramatically increase about 2006. So we're still less than 10 years ago. The production from oil shales started to increase dramatically a bit later than that, more like 2008, after oil prices were in the like $130 range and things started to look more attractive. And if they forecast, and we know forecasts aren't perfect, but these forecasts, every year they do them, they found that in previous years they've underestimated things. And if you look at forecasts out to 2035, it looks like the U.S. oil imports may be just 35% of our consumption. And if you look at exports or imports, which is really what we care about, imports that aren't from North America, it's only 20%. So over that 30-year period, just a remarkable change in the energy production in North America. And as Laura had mentioned in her introduction, those kind of production increases are not just an impact on the energy industry, but they make a huge difference to both Canada and the U.S. on boosting national GDP. They really benefit energy security, and they have a knock-on effect on industry, and particularly heavy manufacturing that has the large energy costs. But with all this good news and big changes in the energy production, there are also some challenges, and infrastructure is one of the big ones. So sufficient infrastructure is needed to support a well-functioning market. And if you have constraints in the infrastructure, and we do have some now, you can hold back market growth, and it also increases price volatility. And keeping in mind that all this infrastructure that we've been talking about, it really is industry constructed, owned, and operated. So as an industry person who has recently joined the government, I kind of always have to, chant to myself, so what's the legitimate role of government? What can and what should government be doing in this area of energy infrastructure? And there are some things that are, I think, appropriate for government to be doing and interacting in this space. They should remove barriers. We talked about not get in the way. No, I'm not in charge of the permitting for the Keystone Pipeline, so I don't want to hear about how we're not really removing barriers in that area, but there's, beyond permitting, there's also a role in assuring safety in the infrastructure, helping protect the infrastructure from things in the 21st century like cyber attacks, and supporting technology, research, and development, which kind of brings me full circle to, while this is government-owned and operated infrastructure, in fact, another thing that the government has the role in, research and development, is actually what got, or at least contributed to this revolution happening, because the hydraulic fracturing technology is actually something that the U.S. government supported the research and development for. So there's maybe a legitimate role for some things for the government to be doing. So one of the things that that I'm doing, mainly in the job that I just started a couple of months ago, is the President Obama has asked for a quadrennial energy review. It's something the government does, quadrennial things. They like to do things every 4 years. But they've asked for one. He sent out a presidential memo in January of this year, wants it done a year from now. So we've got a year to look at infrastructure. And some of the big things in here are, we're looking at an integrated energy strategy, and we need to be working on that in a year. And what we're going to focus it on is infrastructure, because if you look at, and it's not just the Department of Energy, it's all agencies. So if you look at all energy policy across all agencies in the federal government, it's a little like boiling the ocean, and that might be a bit too much to do in a year, especially maybe for the government. So we've decided to focus on infrastructure. And if you're curious why infrastructure, I think there are a number of good reasons. It's got a huge enabling effect, a positive enabling effect on the economy. Periods of sustained growth have been enabled by our investments in canals and railroads and highways, and this could be another one. Helps with the competitive advantage if we had good infrastructure, and conversely, if you don't, it is a bit of a disadvantage. And the reason for looking at infrastructure now, well, and maybe we should have looked at it earlier, but all we can do is look at it now, is that the investments have such a duration. They are very capital intensive, and then they last quite a long time once you get them in place, that you want to be thinking seriously about what you're doing. There are vulnerabilities in the infrastructure, and they're increasing, and all of these things kind of combine to say that there is a legitimate government role here. So in theory, these quadrennial energy reviews are huge studies every 4 years. The managers that I work for and the energy secretary have said, how about, rather than a giant report that we did every 4 years, we do a report every 4 years. And we kind of split this into pieces and try to have something digestible at the end of the year, and also maybe something achievable at the end of the year. So it's not just infrastructure, but we're going to focus on what's classically called T&D infrastructure. We added the S in there because we also want to make sure we look at storage, because actually the government owns storage, like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and the Northeastern Heating Oil Reserves. So storage and distribution, and then the second cycle will probably look at generation, because this study does not have like the oil wells in it or the wind farms. It also does not have things like the cars in it, the end use, or energy efficiency in buildings. So that might be the next one, and maybe supply chains after that, 4th year. We'll see. So that's the kind of the pattern we're looking at, and this first one's storage and distribution. Okay, don't panic. The idea is just to show we have also been doing early work on scoping, but if you look at just the titles in the blue that run vertically, you can see the types of infrastructure that we're looking at. So definitely electricity, so it's pipes and wires, the oil and petroleum pipelines, but also nuclear, biomass, natural gas, wind. So we have been doing a fair amount of work on what will the scope of the infrastructure be, and then by each agency, who's interested in which part. So DOT might be particularly interested, Department of Transportation and Defense might be interested in a different part. EPA is certainly going to have some opinions on pieces of this. So we've been doing a scope on both what's the picture of all the transmission and distribution and storage infrastructure, and then who's involved in which pieces.
About 2 more minutes.
Okay, and a little bit on why this is so important. There's a bit on the age of the infrastructure. It's just shocking how old a bunch of the infrastructure is. One fact I'll leave you with is, remember the recent tragedy in New York with the pipeline, the natural gas pipeline blowing up? I recall it was 107 years old. May have had something to do with it. There are a range of vulnerabilities that we're looking at. Climate certainly has an impact. Cybersecurity, 50% of all the cyber attacks in October of last year, or 2 years ago to May of last year, were on energy installations. So it's a target for cyber attacks. And what we're talking about here, all the huge supply and demand shifts make a big difference. So this is just some of the climate vulnerabilities: lower water levels, wildfires, flooding. They all have big impacts on the infrastructure. This just mentions all the regions are different, and so what infrastructure is needed in each place is dramatically different. And I wanted to make sure I shared this one, although it may upset people in some ways. You don't need to be able to see all the details, but the top map is how many rail loading stations were there for crude in 2010? And how many were there in 2013?
Wow.
And does that look maybe like a workaround for any other infrastructure?
Could you invent the dots and make a
Think
pipeline,
of-
Carol?
So, whether or not the government is making decisions about things, industry continues to move. And so there is really a case for action that we look at what should we be doing as a nation about the infrastructure. I think I may just mention that we really want this to be a study that we're engaging people in. So I already mentioned it's many of the different agencies in the government, but we're also looking at the external stakeholders. So I put on someone put on the memory stick that was handed out, there is a Federal Register notice that came out recently that talks about, I think, a series of 6 or 7 public meetings that we're doing. The first one is next Friday in DC. I think the closest one to here is in Chicago, but we really are trying to bring in a number of people's views on what would be important for us to consider in this study.
Thank you. That's
Okay.
great. While we make the transition to Steve, I just want to ask Carol a question as she comes back to her seat. I believe it was this gentleman here who mentioned the Canadian tendency to meddle into all things United States. Is there any provision in the quadrennial review for consultation with Canada, Canadians,
Yes.
Canadian stakeholders?
Yes,
I can
which
answer
is
that.
why,
I can answer that and tell you that there are 4 of Carol's colleagues in Ottawa today.
yeah,
Excellent.
and which is why I'm here as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Whenever you're ready, Steve.
Thank you, Laura, and I thank the Canadian-U.S. Law Institute for having all of us here. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. As the introduction indicated, I am all about pipelines. In fact, I just often describe my job as making the world safe for pipelines. I've done this for over 30 years, and for more than 20 years, I've been representing pipelines across the U.S.-Canadian border, in both directions, in fact, and so this is an issue near and dear to my heart. I'm going to try to be brief with the introductory parts of, let's see if I can figure out, oh, there we go. The introductory parts, a lot of speakers have already covered the fact that we're undergoing a huge energy revolution in North America. The total transformation of the oil and gas markets has just been tremendous. There's never been a more exciting time in my life to do what I'm doing right now, which is helping pipelines build some new infrastructure to try to deal with all of this. A friend of mine likes to say, and it's only a slight exaggeration, that the only problem with the U.S. pipeline infrastructure is that all the pipelines go in the wrong directions. And there's a lot to that, and as we'll see, part of that is because the new oil that's being discovered and produced is not in the traditional locations. Traditionally, we had a lot of oil on the Gulf Coast of the U.S., and we had a lot of production that was imported from overseas, and so it all came in typically on the coast, and it had to be redistributed to refineries inland. There was some Canadian production which came into the U.S. Midwest, so there were some pipelines going south, but most of the pipelines in the U.S. were not headed south. They were headed north to take this offshore production into the refinery markets. Now we've suddenly got, in addition to the huge increase in production in Western Canada from the oil sands, a just tremendous resource for North America, we've got North Dakota, of all places, is now the second largest oil producing state in the United States, and would be first, except that Texas is also going through an oil shale revolution, and so their production has been increasing as well. But the thing that's in the box there is the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, which is turning out to be one of the most prolific production regions anywhere in the world right now, and certainly in North America. It went from 80,000 barrels a day production in North Dakota in 2006 to approximately 1 million barrels a day of production in North Dakota today, and a projection I saw yesterday has it going to 2 million barrels a day within the next 10 years. And that would be equivalent to the peak production that occurred in Alaska at the height of the oil boom in Alaska. It's a huge development. And there's similar developments going on in the shale fields in Texas, Eagle Ford Shale, the Barnett Shale, and that laps over into Oklahoma. There's a tremendous amount of new oil being produced in non-traditional areas. Similarly, there's a tremendous amount of natural gas being produced in non-traditional areas. That big blob of purple and orange on the right-hand side of the map there is the Marcellus Shale, which runs across a lot of the mid-Atlantic states, including Pennsylvania in particular. And there's been a huge amount of natural gas coming out of the Marcellus Shale. Again, there are also shale gas formations in Texas and other locations. The result is so much more gas flowing into the U.S. now than we've had in decades. This is just a couple of charts to show you where North American crude oil production is headed. You can see Canada going up, U.S. going up. Mexico staying fairly stable, but I'll talk about in a minute the fact that that's a third party to this North American triangle who's also going to be contributing in future years. North American natural gas production is booming. As mentioned earlier, almost all of the shale gas production in the world occurs in the U.S. and Canada. China, it's practically invisible, and most of Europe has been very slow to adopt hydraulic fracking. France, for example, has banned it. Many of the other countries haven't specifically banned it, but they haven't been very quick to embrace it. This is just a very visual representation of what's going on in U.S. oil production. It's just a total change from 10 years ago. As I said, the Bakken production is one of the biggest contributors to that. Northwestern Canada, likewise, is producing a huge increase. The production for 2015, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers projects 3.65 million barrels a day of oil. By 2025, that's 5.85 million barrels a day. That's another equivalent of 2 million barrels a day that we don't have today. And then our friends to the south. The government of Mexico has recently enacted a historic legislative change to open up their industry to foreign investment for the first time in about 100 years. And while the details of that are yet to be worked out, there's great prospects for development in Mexico. On the map I showed earlier, you can see that a lot of the shale oil fields and shale gas fields in the U.S. cross the border. And there is a tremendous opportunity in Mexico, if conditions are right, for those fields to be exploited as well. And all of that is leading to the prospect that North America could literally be oil and gas self-sufficient in a fairly short time and for probably decades thereafter. What's the biggest issue holding all this back? Well, there's obviously a lot of things that are required for all these projects to develop, but energy infrastructure, as a number of people have mentioned, is really critical to this. And particularly the current scarcity of energy infrastructure, the fact that the pipelines mostly run the wrong way, has led to a lot of price differentials. We've seen gaps of as much as $20, $30, $40 a barrel between coastal markets and inland markets for crude oil. We see the U.S. price of gas is much, much lower than in the rest of the world, and a lot of this has to do with the lack of infrastructure. It was mentioned earlier how many pipelines already cross the border between the U.S. and Canada. This is a map that gives you a good sense of the existing pipeline network pre-Keystone XL. By the way, it was mentioned that earlier, one of the speakers mentioned that Alberta Clipper had gotten their presidential permit fairly smoothly. I think it was Ambassador Jacobson, and that, of course, Keystone has had a lot of problems. And I'm sure there are a lot of explanations for that, other than the fact that my law firm represented Alberta Clipper, did not represent Keystone XL. Draw your own conclusions. The process for U.S. regulatory approval for oil and gas pipelines is first of all, different between the two and fairly complex. But in essence, on the oil side, there is no federal regulator who approves the building of new oil pipelines. It's basically a state-level process, with the exception that if you want to cross a border, like the U.S.-Canada border, you have to have a presidential permit, and that requires you to deal with this State Department process that we're all now so familiar with. But if you're not crossing the border, if you're just an ordinary garden variety new pipeline, there really is no process set out in statute or regulations for getting approval for your project. What is developed is kind of a workaround at the FERC, and I've done a lot of these. It's been fairly successful. It's called, you go to the FERC and you ask for a petition for declaratory order, essentially ask the FERC to declare.
FERC is a what?
I'm sorry, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, excuse me, you can tell I'm an insider. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will grant these declaratory orders to tell you what kinds of economic treatment and regulatory treatment are you going to get once you build your pipeline. And lots of pipelines are now in the process of getting those. Just the last bullet there were 3 of them granted in 2010 and 2011. There have been 25 granted in 2012 and 2013, and I'm sure there are at least a dozen pending right now. So this has become a very active form of regulatory approving. On the gas pipeline side, it's a little simpler because the statute sets forward a straightforward process for approval of natural gas pipelines. But again, you go to the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to get a certificate of public convenience and necessity. Unlike the oil side, that does require you to do a full-scale environmental impact statement. So there's a several-year-long process of getting that environmental review. But once you get your certificate as a natural gas pipeline, you sort of then roll over all the other kinds of local and state requirements, and you can generally get your pipeline built fairly expeditiously. if you're importing or exporting, the rules are a little different. The U.S. Amount of imports we have has been going down, as has been mentioned by a number of people. It's gone from 65% to less than 40%, fairly short. I'm sorry, from 61% to 35% in a fairly short period of time. But the laws governing U.S. oil imports and exports are really a product of a different era. So since the 1970s, when oil was in short supply and we were worried about the Arab oil embargo and all those things, the U.S. has prohibited exports of domestically produced crude oil without a license. And those licenses are very, very difficult to get. You can export crude oil to Canada relatively easily, and exports are allowed from Alaska relatively easily. With those exceptions, it's virtually impossible to export U.S. oil under current law. Canada, on the other hand, has not generally tried to control the export of crude oil, although that may be because 99% of their exports currently go to the U.S., and because of NAFTA, they couldn't really do anything about prohibiting that. But in any event, that's not been the issue. Nonetheless, it's worth noting that the U.S. ban on oil exports is having effects on Canada because, again, as we saw from the map, most of Canada's oil exports go through those pipelines that run through the U.S. And surprisingly, the little molecules in the pipeline don't identify themselves as being from Canada or the U.S. They're just molecules. And so there's a great deal of difficulty in persuading the regulatory authorities in the U.S. to allow even Canadian oil to be exported once it reaches, say, the Gulf Coast, because it's in the same pipelines with oil that was produced in the U.S., which is prohibited from export.
Well, 2 more minutes.
Okay. Let me wrap up there on the regulatory side, and I'm going to spend my last 2 minutes pretending to be Richard Cunningham, who unfortunately his plane was canceled. He's unable to be here today. But Richard is one of my colleagues at Steptoe & Johnson, a very eminent expert in international trade, and I'm going to give you the thumbnail version of what he would have said much more eloquently and learnedly had he been here. But this is the summary of his comments, and it really builds off what I was just saying. We have this system where it has been possible to export U.S. crude oil. It is difficult, although not impossible, to export natural gas in the form of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and there are a number of projects. I think there's currently 20 permit applications pending for LNG exports. One of them has actually made it through the whole process, which involves getting a DOE permit, first of all, and then a FERC review. Just like you were a gas pipeline, you have to go through the whole EIS process for one of these. But there are others in the pipeline, and expectation is more and more of these will be approved as time goes on, but it's still a cumbersome process. And Dick Cunningham's point as a trade lawyer was, if other countries were doing this, if another country was banning the export of a product that was in plentiful supply in that country solely in order to benefit its domestic industry by keeping the price low, we would be having a real problem with that from a trade standpoint. And so there's a trade law aspect to this whole problem that hasn't really come into the debate at this point. We're about to have, I think, a fairly major political debate in the U.S. about allowing oil exports. We're already having this debate about LNG exports. We've got people on one side saying, well, we should really keep the price of these products low, although I should note that the price of gasoline in the U.S. is not set based on the domestic oil price. It's set based on the world oil price, because we still do import oil from the rest of the world. So this is not about gasoline prices, but there is an issue about, for example, using natural gas as feedstock in the petrochemical industry. If you're a member of the petrochemical industry, you might like to see those prices kept very low. But the question is it better for the country as a whole if we have a more free market in these products? And as was indicated by our first speaker this morning, let the products find their best use in particular countries where they need to go. But there is, I think Dick's point would be, in addition to having a political debate, we may also be having a legal debate, because there are trade laws that impact what a country can do when they're parties to these various agreements like GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and others. So I will stop impersonating Dick Cunningham, and I hope nobody will ask me any questions about that part of his presentation, since I know nothing about international law.
Okay, group, we are great for time, and I appreciate the fact that my panel is letting me compress their presentations a little bit because it's so jam-packed. So I'm going to take a few minutes for questions, but here are my rules. Your question should not be longer than a minute to say, and it must end in a question mark. So let's take 2 questions now, and then we'll move to the other panelists. Sir.
Do you know why France banned this process?
I assume for environmental concerns, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. I just know that generally France has been very resistant to opening this up. And I think other countries, as I understand it, Germany, for example, has not banned it, but they really have made it very difficult for that to happen. And much of the EU, I think, is the same. I think it's because there's a heightened sensitivity there, shall we say, to environmental concerns.
Sir.
Wouldn't that be population density would be an issue in addition to scientific ignorance?
Well, I think that very well could be a factor. Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, for example, in the U.S., you see very little opposition in North Dakota to hydraulic fracturing. It's being done every day. I hear nobody protesting that. But in Pennsylvania, which is much more densely populated industrial state, it's a huge issue about hydraulic fracturing of natural gas.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is that they've been fracking in Michigan, in mid-northern Michigan, for 10 years. And there's thousands of wells. You don't see them after they've been drilled because it's a small little compressor in the woods. But there's a committee now that's been formed to stop fracking with the idea that somehow this is new. It's been going on in Michigan for a decade. There's never been a complaint or an incident yet. Let's keep our fingers crossed. But Michigan, I can speak with authority, is a huge environmental state. We're huge on water quality, air quality, much tougher than the surrounding states.
Carol, do you want to
And it never had a complaint. It's really interesting. But there's a group that thinks it's brand new, like oil sands are brand new. So we have this information gap here, not just distrust of technology and fossil fuels, but a gap. And I'm just wondering how you deal with that, how all of you deal with that.
That's a great question. Carol, do you want to comment about public response to fracking?
So I'm of the same opinion. I'm not as familiar, but I think France is all about environmental concerns. And I think we have to recognize, while we might not like it, that perception is reality for some folks, and there are concerns about fracking. Part of the concerns are seismic, and some are groundwater related. There are concerns about the reporting of what chemicals are used. So I think while the US and Canada are well ahead on these technologies, there are maybe people might disagree about whether they're legitimate environmental concerns or not, but there are definitely legitimate issues really causing problems, but there's absolutely public concern about it that needs to be addressed, and education. And while I have the microphone, I actually have a question for the room. I rarely get to talk to a room that is mainly lawyers. So in the very end of the presentation, you were talking about legal international law and imports and exports. So I hear tell, but don't have a lot of information. And if anyone knew anything about this law or found out about it and could tell me, I would love to know. I hear that there's a law from colonial times in the US, still on the books, related to cotton exports, where it's illegal to constrain exports from the US solely for the purpose of keeping domestic prices low. So if anyone knew anything about that, I'm just saying, someone maybe would know or could find out.
I think that's true, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, I don't need to know now. We could discuss later.
Admiral Parks.
Yes, if I could, and I have absolutely no idea other than Eli Whitney, cotton gin, that's about as far as I can go on that. But
Before that.
yeah, if I could ask Carol, you talked about infrastructure and the vulnerabilities. You know, it's common knowledge the electrical grid is in, dire straits. What have we learned, or what are we doing? Because we haven't really done much about that. And we're talking about creating more and more infrastructure, federal or otherwise, that needs to be protected. How are we going to go about that, and how's that going to play out? How does that fit into your calculus?
So it doesn't apply as much to the shale discussion that we're having, but the quadrennial energy review that I was talking about has the electric grid as a big part of it. I guess I wouldn't agree with nothing has been done. I would agree with not enough has been done.
Still extremely vulnerable.
It's still extremely vulnerable. There have been hardening efforts, you know, from as simple as, you know, making the fences opaque and not just chain link so that you can't see where to shoot at the transformers, to other, you know, superior methods for protecting things. But there are a range of things happening already, some of which are classified, some of which get into the Wall Street Journal, even though maybe they shouldn't. But there is an effort going on looking at both the vulnerabilities of the existing grid, what can be done about that, as well as what are disruptive competing technologies, like if there was distributed generation and islanding of some systems, then the 9 transformer stations, substations that could be taken down to take the whole grid down wouldn't be a reality.
Thank you. Last question from the gentleman in the middle, please.
Sorry, it's not a question.
It has to end in a question mark.
Just with respect to Stephen DeBoer, Government of Canada. Just with respect to France and shale gas, I think the one thing that we may need to take into consideration, and I don't know this for a fact, but I don't think exploitation of shale gas fits within France's picture on how to tackle climate change.
Excellent. Okay, I think this is a great opportunity to move to the Lagniappe side of the panel, and two folks who have been productively and usefully meddling in the affairs of the other sovereign nation for many years. I'll start with Mark and then move on to Sue, and you don't have to speak from the podium if you don't want to. Speak from your chair if that's better.
Great, because I don't have any slides. So first of all, I just wanted to thank Laura for the kind introduction, and also David Koken and Kusley for inviting me to participate in this year's conference. As someone who comes from Ottawa, Canada, it's always a pleasure to leave the 3 feet of snow that's sitting in your front yard. As Laura mentioned, I'm the first executive director of the Council of the Great Lakes Region. As she mentioned, we're a new binational organization that was launched right here in Cleveland about a year ago with the help of Ambassador Jacobson, Rear Admiral Michael Parks, Minister Jim Peterson, Governor Blanchard, as well as David and Laura. The aim of the council is quite simple. It's to cultivate a strong regional voice by connecting government, people, groups, initiatives across the spectrum of interest, from government, not-for-profit, community, in order to develop a common cause on issues ranging from economic growth, protecting the environment, and deepening cross-border and cross-sectoral collaboration to address gaps in regional leadership, knowledge, and advocacy. I think it's actually quite an interesting new model for binational governance. It mirrors quite closely what's happening out west in terms of the Pacific Northwestern Economic Region. I don't know how it fits in your book, Diane, but it's certainly an interesting model that's gaining some traction. And as I said before, it's a simple objective, but it's an extremely important one when you look at the region. There's roughly 105 million Americans and Canadians who live in the region, which, if you were to put that into a country, would be the 12th largest in the world. Again, the region's non-farm economy in 2013 was valued at $5 trillion US dollars, which, again, if it were a country, would be the 4th largest economy in the world, behind the US, China, and Japan. The region accounts for roughly 29% of R&D in the US and 77% of R&D in Canada. 20 of the top 100 universities in the world are located in the region. It is also a significant hub of activity with respect to US-Canada energy trade, production, distribution, and exploration. And one just has to look at the natural gas industry to get a full appreciation of the level of activity and integration that exists. In terms of infrastructure and distribution, we've touched on it a little bit here. Around the Great Lakes, there are roughly 12 natural gas import points and export points between the 8 Great Lakes states and Canada, from Noyes, Minnesota, out to Messina, which account for nearly half, that's 39%, of the total number of import-export points along the entire US-Canada border. So it's actually, from a trade standpoint, is a very relevant and important region. There's 2 main trade corridors coming into the region that I'd like to touch on a little bit. One is the Western Canada Midwestern US corridor. This transportation corridor lies between the Western Canadian supply systems and the Western Sedimentary Basin and the US Midwest. and links two Canadian systems, the Trans-Canada Pipeline Limited and Foothills Pipeline Company, with three U.S. pipeline systems, the Great Lakes Gas Transmission Company, the Northern Border Pipeline Company, and Viking Gas Transmission Company. In addition, the 1,300-mile Alliance Pipeline, which is completed in late 2000, provides a direct transportation route for wet natural gas between producing fields in northwestern British Columbia and Alberta, and a gas-producing plant, Au Sable, located outside of Chicago, Illinois. What's interesting about these points is that when they're tied together, they represent about 41% of total U.S. natural gas imports capacity in 2006. So again, it's a significant hub. In 2000, another pipeline, the Vector Pipeline System, located between Chicago, Illinois, and Dawn, Ontario, at the eastern end of the corridor, was put in service to provide an alternative expansion route for Canadian gas and service to customers in Ontario, Canada. Now, an additional corridor, the Western Canada to Northeastern U.S. This portion of the system corridor links Trans-Canada Pipelines and the Western Canadian gas production to 7 pipeline companies in northeastern U.S. that transport gas primarily into New York and New England. The 7 are the Iroquois Pipeline Company, the North Country Pipeline Company, the Portland Gas Transmission System, the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company, the Empire Pipeline Company, the Vermont Gas Company, and the St. Lawrence Gas Company. Indirectly, the corridor also supplies gas to the Natural Fuel Gas Supply Company and Dominion Transmission Company. While the vast majority of the Canadian capacity that comes into the U.S. Northeast is off the northern tier of the Trans-Canada system, and I wish I had some of the maps to demonstrate, about 5% represents capacity that traverses the U.S. Midwest, crosses back into Canada through Ontario, and is imported once again into Niagara and New York. In addition to the miles of pipeline that traverse the region is also home to 5 market centers, with 2 in Illinois, the Joliet and the Chicago hubs, 1 in Pennsylvania, the Dominion hub, 1 in New York, the Iroquois hub, and 1 in Ontario, the Dawn Market Center. The reason I'm mentioning all this is, taken all together, it's a well-established strategic market for the North American economy. Looking forward, the Great Lakes region can very well lead the natural gas renaissance, and there are important changes taking place in the market that could change the flow and trade in the natural gas in the region, such as the increased production from the Marcellus Shale region, which has led to a decline in natural gas imports from Canada in the eastern part of the U.S. In fact, just recently, the import point at Niagara Falls was reversed, and natural gas is now being exported to Ontario through New York State. This reversal is a direct result of increased production in the Marcellus Shale. Other plays that have come that could have a positive and significant impact on the regional and North American natural gas market include the Utica and the Antrim Shale formations. The Utica Shale Formation, which encompasses most of the Great Lakes region, is a rich source rock and organic content that shows great potential. And another formation that we're more familiar with in the Michigan area is the Antrim Shale, which is situated in the Michigan Basin in the U.S. and also traverses over into southern parts of Ontario. In 2009, this play was the 15th most productive natural gas play in the U.S. However, in order for the region to fully benefit from these deposits, we need to create a business environment that is predictable for developers, welcoming for investors, and equally we need to develop the deposits responsibly. In this regard, we need to find a more efficient way of reviewing and permitting interstate pipeline proposals as well as pipeline projects crossing the U.S.-Canada border, as licensing delays that result from overly burdensome regulations and or different environmental objectives can create unnecessary bottlenecks, and this kind of system can strand valuable reserves in the ground. On the issue of reviewing projects that cross the U.S.-Canada border, in my view, it's unthinkable in today's global economy that we can let a border which literally has no width to it to disrupt the further integration of the regional North American energy market. The amped up political discourse over pipelines of late hasn't helped either. I'm hopeful that the President's announcement of the Quadrennial Review, which Carol had touched on, will look at the energy infrastructure equation, particularly as it relates to the cross-border element. However, it also might be time for Congress, in its role in having the powers for foreign commerce and interstate commerce, to look at new ways of regulating the permitting and licensing of interstate pipelines and cross-border pipelines. After all, it's Congress that has the power to regulate in these areas. We are fortunate to have one regulator in international interprovincial oil and gas in Canada in electricity, and that's the National Energy Board. And that's certainly worth considering in the U.S. I think having the one-stop shop regulator makes sense for a lot of business and for government. Another idea worth considering, even though it needs refinement, is the principle of one project, one review, a practice that was legislated recently in Canada in order to streamline the assessment process. In this regard, the Council of the Great Lakes Region is hoping to launch a review of energy trends and future prospects in the region to look at how we regulate in the Great Lakes region, how we undertake research and development together, and how do we look at developing a strategy around a clean energy future for the Great Lakes. And when you look at all the different regulatory issues that are going on, I think we as a region and the council are trying to find a way of starting a conversation where we start talking about the North American energy market as a continental market, not a US market, not a Canadian market, and not a Mexican market. And if we can try and do that, at least at the regional level, I think we can certainly try and add value, at least to the political discourse, about how that might be able to, how that could be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. When we're talking about competitiveness, energy competitiveness, trade competitiveness, I heard somebody say recently, and I agree very much, that government has to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And in the case of energy in particular, we need government there. And so it's a question of how to help them to lead better or get out of the way faster. So how would an organization like Council of the Great Lakes Region, Canada-US Law Institute, Cleveland, Canada Business Council, what role would they have in helping governments to lead better? Let's start. This is your question, Mark. This is your spotlight. This is your spotlight question.
I guess for me, the value added of the council is that it's not just a government-to-government conversation. So we're bringing in private sector partners. We're bringing in those throughout the Great Lakes that are concerned about the environment, and we are trying to have a far-reaching in an integrated conversation. And so when you look at the energy sector, and when you look at issues around, let's say, shale gas exploration and the future of fracking, I think there's one thing that I've learned around spending way too much time on Keystone is that the knowledge base is fractured, and for whatever reason, different perceptions have developed in different quarters. So whether it's the environmental community or the business community, and so as a council, if we can bring people together in a meaningful way and try and break down some of those, tear apart some of those perceptions and create a more of a true knowledge base around the future of shale gas and how do you develop that resource responsibly for the full benefit of the region. I think there's some value there in striking that conversation, and B, from a regulatory standpoint, doing some research that informs government decision making in terms of its own rules and regulations and processes, and that certainly doesn't have to be undertaken by government anymore. And I think that councils like the Council of the Great Lakes Region, or even Panmure for that example, can do that kind of work. I think provide some valuable insights into initiatives like the Quadrennial Review. So I think it's a unique forum, and I think again the value that we provide is that we're able to bring disparate groups together to try and build a common understanding and a common view in terms of how you can develop a resource like shale gas or shale oil in the region.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Follow-up question.
1 minute question. It's got to have a question mark at the end.
30 seconds.
Okay.
Thank you. Is there a separate strategy for my home state of New York, which has stood in the way of fracking with an eternal moratorium?
Well, I think, in terms of the moratoriums, I think the moratoriums have been put in place just because the knowledge base around shale gas, shale oil, and how you explore it is not as well developed as it could be. So I understand politically why, in the absence of sound information, that you might want to throw a moratorium in place, because that's the safe thing to do politically. And other jurisdictions have done it. They've done it in Quebec, for example. I think there's a moratorium in the St. Lawrence River. And that's a safe thing to do early on, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be at the table in trying to break down those perceptions on this side of the issue or that side of the issue, to try and come to a common understanding, a common knowledge base in how you deal with this. Because I think, it is it's funny, you look at shale gas and shale oil and concerns over the development, but it's a much cleaner resource to develop than let's say perhaps others. So if New York is interested in having a low carbon, clean energy future, at some point, I think it has to have a very real conversation about how it develops its resources, and shale gas, figures into that. So the moratorium, I understand why it's in place right now, but I think the council, can bring New York and others to the table, or New York on its own, should not stop having a conversation about, how it looks at this issue going forward. I don't think moratoriums are there forever.
Good, thank you. There was a comment this morning from my friend and now that he's a new consultant, new competitor, Larry Herman, about leaders summits and how when we have summits, there doesn't seem to be quite enough attention paid to the business of cross-border cooperation and what we're going to do together. I apologize if I've mischaracterized that, but it's a good stepping off point for what we're going to talk about next. Because my impression is that while the summit is a very important focusing point, there are hundreds, thousands of hours of staff time and public-private sector consultation that go on in order to find the basis for common ground, find the basis for initiatives that we can work on together. And so one of the warriors in that fight has been my favorite Minnesotan, Sue Sarnio.
Thanks, Laura. And as someone who grew up on the Great Lakes, I'm a Duluth native myself, so I grew up on Lake Superior. So I applaud the Great Lakes Council Initiative, Mark and Laura, and Admiral Parks, all your work at Koosley has done on that. And I thank you for including me here today. When Governor Blanchard and Ambassador Jacobson suggested it might be helpful for me to come here and talk about the North American Leaders Summit and how that frames the North American energy picture, I agreed, because in my business in the State Department, it's usually very good to do what ambassadors suggest. It's very career enhancing. So I thought I should come out to talk to you. Even ex-ambassadors, it helps. But I think, Ambassador Freeman and others have referred to the dysfunction in Washington, and I'm not going to defend Washington right now, because I can assure you, coming back from Ottawa, Washington is a very dysfunctional place. But I think in the North American space, the space that you're working in and the space that you're interested, we're talking about today, it's actually working pretty well. And when we had the North American Leaders Summit in Toluca in March, I'm pretty sure most of you never even noticed that it happened. President Obama, President Peña Nieto, and Prime Minister Harper met in Toluca, which is President Peña Nieto's hometown. And it didn't get a lot of attention in the news, but for those of us working on North America in the government, they say the Wizard of Oz says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I think you have to peel back the curtain to see what goes beyond that kind of thing, because as Laura mentioned, there's a lot of work. And Mark knows, Mark and I were in meetings together planning for it many months before the leaders actually get together. There's a lot of government bureaucrats who are getting together and talking about what can the leaders talk about, what is facing the continent, and what are the big issues of the day. And to say it's a set piece, Larry, I think you're right. I mean, you put them in front of the cameras, they answer a couple questions, and they move on. That's the set piece. But the important thing is the what's below the iceberg, below the surface of what's gone on to prepare for that, and what the leaders and what the people in the government are saying. And so I think my argument to you would be, actually take a look at the communique that was put out by the three leaders, and you'll get an idea of where our policy is in North America. And I think there's actually some pretty good clarity for a change in government, and where the government wants to go in working with Canada and the U.S. and Mexico in that construct. So, it might have been 6 months or more preparation, a lot of input from the academic world, the think tanks. I think there probably were any number of a dozen to 2 dozen papers that were put out by different groups in the lead up to that, and we did read those, and Laura was the author of one of the key ones, one of the better ones, I will say. A lot of the business groups put together recommendations and sent letters in, and Eric is here. He contributed to one of those, I know. And so I think you should know that the government officials did listen to what's being said out there. We were asked not to be incremental, and they don't like incremental, but I think government does things incrementally. I think that's the way we get things done, and I would argue that in the last couple months we've made some major steps. And if you didn't read the communique, let me give you a couple of examples. And again, these are announcements that may have just gone by unnoticed, but we announced we're going to have a trilateral trusted traveler program. We have a Nexus program now with Canada. We have the Century program with Mexico for trusted travelers. Can I ask, can I just poll the room? How many Canadians, how many Americans here have a Nexus card or a global entry card? Bet all the Canadians, right? Yeah. You know what? We're up to almost 1 million Nexus cards issued. It's phenomenal, and I think it's, if you went through the airport on the way here or on the way out, you go through TSA pre-check. It's a great thing not to have to take your computer out of your briefcase. But I think doing that trilaterally makes a huge amount of sense. We've got 2 legs of that stool. We have to fix the Mexico-Canada part of it, and I think that's a challenge. But I think it's a good commitment by our leaders to try to, wring out those inefficiencies that make it harder for borders and business to work across borders. They also announced that they're going to be looking at a North American transportation plan. When we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about roads and bridges and all those things that Carol mentioned, things that are 40 years, 50 years more than that out of date and need to be reformed. How are we going to work together to try to address those problems at a time when governments on all sides of these borders don't have a lot of resources? I think there's some momentum going there, and I will say yesterday in Washington, something momentous happened. The Northern Border Caucus and the Southern Border Caucus of the Congress got together and had a meeting on infrastructure. Can I tell you that we have been trying to encourage that for many years? And instead of fighting over the scarce resources and saying, well, we want funding for San Ysidro, not for Alexandria Bay or whatever, and seeing it as a trade-off, where what you win, I lose, the members in Congress who serve in the border states are finally seeing that if they work together, they could maybe support each other's infrastructure projects and maybe get some funding for some of those badly needed infrastructure projects at the border. So, if you work in the Great Lakes region, you know what those choke points can be. And I think we're going to start finding ways to address that. And so there's some momentum going there. The leaders also announced that they were going to cooperate on energy security in the hemisphere. And I think it's great that we're all looking at China and wow, it's whiz-bang, there's major changes there and all these things are happening. But you need to look at this hemisphere and see. I'm really glad that you, Stephen, you mentioned the Mexico changes, because it's phenomenal what's happening in Mexico. I started out my career as a diplomat in Mexico, and when I look at what they're doing right now in the energy sector, it is really remarkable, and I think we all have to be paying attention to that.
So, sorry, can you define what we mean by energy security?
We had a lot of long talks about this, Laura, and I think, what we were thinking of and what the folks are, first of all, they said this is too big an issue for just the leaders to handle and the energy ministers. No, really, it's too, look at Carol's presentation. It's a huge issue to talk about energy on the continent. So the first thing they did was they said, let's get the energy ministers together. So the Secretary of Energy and the energy ministers are going to be meeting they said by the 4th quarter of 2014. I think they wanted to get the QER work out of the way before they actually get everybody together. But it is true that they've said if we're going to look at infrastructure, we need to be working with Mexico and Canada. There's no way we can do it without looking at both. And so I think that's a space to watch. But also, we have to look at Central America and the Caribbean as far as energy goes. And people go, what, Central America and the Caribbean? Watch that space too, because the Caribbean markets rely on energy principally from Venezuela. Venezuela hasn't been the most stable country in the hemisphere lately, and I think our leaders are the people who are looking ahead and sort of saying, where are the problems that we're going to be facing in the next couple of years? They've said we need to be talking together. We need to be looking at what the regulatory framework is in those parts of the world, and we need to work together to address those challenges. So that's one thing the leaders committed to do, and we'll be meeting and talking with our counterparts in Mark's old office and in Mexico City in the next few months to figure out how we're going to do that. I think the point that somebody made about interfering in internal affairs of other countries, that's such a taboo to a diplomat. We always want to be diplomatic and not get into the internal affairs. But I think when it comes to the US, Canada, and also with Mexico now, we're getting to a point where we're looking at our internal issues and saying, how do we make this marketplace, this North American marketplace that sits in between the huge market in Europe, the huge market in Asia, and how do we make it more efficient? And we have to look at the borders and how we're running those. We have to look at our regulatory systems. The US government did something remarkable that most people didn't notice. The president issued an executive order that said, from now on, any regulations being passed by the US, enacted by the US government, have to look at the international trade implications. That's huge. And so our Office of Management and Budget, the office that handles the Paperwork Reduction Act, has to take into consideration the impact on international trade of any of our new regulations. The Canadians seemed to think that was a great idea. We're hoping they're going to be looking at the same thing. We were encouraging them to, and we'd like to encourage the Mexicans to too. Because as we go forward, it's hard to undo the tangled web of regulatory and rules that are different, that have grown up over the years. But at least if we're going forward and we're adopting new regulations, for God's sake, let's make sure that they don't stop trade, they don't, going back to these things that you're looking at in the energy sector. And I think we are, as Mexico, for example, looks at its drilling regulations, that they're coming to us, they're talking to us about how our regulations work. I think they're going to talk to the Canadians too. As we look at things like fracking and the regulations there, I think we have to be talking together. And emissions, it's one area where for vehicles, with our auto sector, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, right? I think that's one area where we've got it pretty much lined up, but we're not exactly there, but we've had to make our regulations work together. So I think that we do have to, especially in the geographic space that we're in, I think we do have to meddle a bit. And as a diplomat, that's probably, I'll probably get fired for saying that, but I think as a realist and as somebody who wants to see free markets and see the markets move and see the United States and Canada and Mexico be competitive, I think we have to look at that.
Thank you. I think we call that cross-border cooperation.
Yes.
I like that. Okay, so I'm going to get to Mr. Hornby in a second, but how many law students do we have in the room? Okay, I want to put you on notice that I'm not letting these guys leave for lunch until I get a law student question, so think about it now. Ross Hornby, GE, please.
Yeah, I have a question for Sue, but maybe the other panelists would like to talk about it. I did notice that the leaders met in Toluca.
You do read those things.
I think no one did.
Former.
And I did, and I thought the most interesting development from the meeting was actually what you referred to, the forthcoming meeting of ministers of energy. And I guess my question relates to North American energy integration. And do you think that will provide perhaps cover for the kind of infrastructure projects that are held up across the continent, that people will see this as not just a one-off or one issue, but really a question that is related more to the need for that energy security, energy abundance, and using that to put NAFTA region in a more competitive position vis-a-vis other countries, and actually lead in a company like GE to a renaissance in manufacturing in North America?
That's a great question. Anyone and everyone. Start with Sue, but I'd like to get Steve's perception on that as well.
I mean, I think when we sat down to say what has changed the most since the last time the leaders met, the obvious answer was the energy markets have changed. Everyone's talked about how this is the biggest change in 100 years in a lot of ways. So how do we get them to talk about it in a fulsome way that and everyone said, well, this has to be a long discussion and not just a one-off pronouncement of saying we're going to cooperate. So I think that you're right. I think the energy ministers, whatever they meet, but I also think that our quadrennial review is going to be important in that, because I think we're going to look at where are we going and sort of what is the government philosophy on where these markets go, and how do we handle the need to, do we want to be shipping the oil by rail? Do we want to be shipping it by pipeline? Do we want to, how do we want to be doing that? And I don't think we've fully answered that question internally in the U.S. yet. And just even The polls are kind of split on a lot of these questions, and so I think we have to kind of figure that out. And that may actually be some of the issues that are going to come up in the by-elections in this year too, in November, I think. Maybe the politicians want to talk about that too, but.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to talk about the North American energy competitiveness and?
Well, yeah, the comment I would make on that is that I totally agree with what Sue just said about trying to make the regulatory system more rational and consistent, because a good example is the rapid expansion of rail, movements of crude by rail in the last 5 years. It's just been dramatic. And a lot of that was because there was no real government role in that. The railroads didn't have to go to anybody to get permission to do this, they just did it. They already had rail tracks that crossed the border, they already had rail cars, they already had the authorizations they needed to operate because they're carrying lots of other commodities. Oil was just one more thing. But in order for a pipeline to be built to compete with that, even if it's more efficient, even if it's safer, even if it's more reliable, it has to go through this huge, yeah, it costs $10 a barrel less on average. It still has to go through this huge process of review. And so some rationalization so that we aren't just accidentally ending up in a place where oil is being transported by a particular mode because it was easy to do as opposed to another one that might have been better but was cumbersome from a regulatory standpoint would make, I think, a big difference.
Carol.
Just getting some facts in there, because I hear people debating oil by rail, and I'm not sure everyone gets some of the distinctions in it. For the U.S., as much as you're hearing about oil by rail, by ton miles, I think is the way that they often measure it, oil by rail in the U.S. is maybe 5–6%, but if you look at Bakken oil by rail, it's about 60 or 70. So it really is, it's a Bakken issue, oil by rail.
Mark, anything on competitive?
The only thing I would add on the competitive side, I think the market has been in the North American space for a long time. I think it's amazing that they've been able to design the system they've been able to design with all the different overlapping rules and regulations. I think the challenge has been and continues to be getting the policy, the public policy and the politics right. And I think, we tried to have a conversation in the lead up to the North American Leaders Summit about, starting that, addressing that issue, but, with the quadrennial review being started, with Mexico just starting off on the path of implementing its secondary legislation on its energy reforms, the whole North American integration piece just became a very difficult conversation to have at that moment in time. Whether or not the three ministers will be able to pick it up at the end of the year, I certainly hope it is the main thing on the agenda, because if it's just talking about research and development and those pieces, I think there's a moment lost. That is the big outstanding question right now, is how do you square the politics? Because if you can't do that, then I think the North American marketplace is going to continue to struggle to patchwork this thing together in a way that is efficient and effective for them.
And if Dick Cunningham were here, he would say, I think, that it makes a great deal of sense to reduce the transaction costs and regulatory costs by reducing the impediments and the barriers. But when you get to the point of keeping those prices low because you've got export prohibitions, then you're now distorting markets and you're negatively affecting the conditions of competition. I need a law student question. Are you a law student?
Yes.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Anthony.
Hi, Anthony.
I'm a law student, so one thing that a few people kind of mentioned was this idea of, coming together with removing the barriers for information. Kind of since there's a number of sides, it seems to get like a polarized issue. I suppose what I'm asking is, do you think there's a role for government to take like a really proactive stance? I think you were saying, Carol, like leading on this almost as an arbiter of taking both sides' relevant points and really proactively going to the public and saying, these are the relevant, or these are the pros of their points, these are the weaknesses of their points. For example, like fracking. The environmentalist side will just kind of say that, groundwater issues, seismicity, and then the industry side will say, this has been going on for 60 years, don't worry about it. And there really isn't a conversation about why it has been, fractures follow the path of least resistance, and that goes along the stratigraphic boundary. But the weakness is, sometimes there is groundwater contamination if there's poor cementing on a wellbore or something like that. That type of information doesn't seem to be getting out to the public in general, and I'm wondering if you think there is a role for that and how best to facilitate that.
Great question. Carol?
So I think there is definitely a government role in some of what you talked about. There's certainly a role in the safety and the protection of groundwater and in making sure that there are good rules and regulations about what's allowable in that space to try to protect the environment. There's also an issue in some of the seismic area. The general, like the question we had before about New York and the prohibition, there are also a lot of state issues in there as well, and whether the state decides to just ban it altogether, or I know Colorado has introduced a number of more progressive regulations about how to manage it and control it. So there's also a state issue. I think there's also a role for industry. They might not be perceived always as the most credible in trying to explain the pros and cons of it, but they do have the most information about it, and it is, I think, part of what they should try to do is to help educate. So I think there's a role for a lot of people in that space, and it's maybe when you have that many people have a role, maybe that seems like no one's doing as much as they could because they're like, well, the state should be doing that. But there's some federal role, but not all. Classic, it depends government answer.
Just a quick down the table, either answering that question or a final comment.
Just very quickly, Carol
left.
mentioned that the government has a part in that, so does industry, and maybe this group and that group. And I think the value of the council is that we'll bring all of those voices together and try and give people the best state of play in terms of what's going on around shale gas or any other issue. So I think that's the value from a governance perspective of having something like the council, because we can convene and facilitate those kind of conversations to lift that level of knowledge. And governments from there can then decide what they want to do with it, but at least we're all working from the same song sheet.
Soup?
We're singing from the same song sheet.
We're good. See? All right, turn it over. First of all, thank the panel for their wonderful.
Thank you very much again. What a fascinating discussion. At this point, we're going to have a short break for everybody to pick up lunches, which will be across the hall. We're going to try to get started in about 10 or so minutes. We do have a couple people who will be trying to catch flights. So if you do happen to come in while we're doing introductions, please be quiet and quietly take your seat, and we'll see you again shortly.